They mocked it as a flimsy American toy. But when the desert swallowed German trucks whole, one tiny machine kept moving, towing guns, climbing mountains, and rewriting battlefield mobility. North Africa, early 1943. The desert sky was white with heat, the kind that made distant objects shimmer, bend, and disappear into the horizon. A battered column of German supply trucks crept across the sands. Opel Blitz transports groaning under crates of ammunition, food, and spare parts. The engines coughed, the tires skidded, and every few kilometers another truck stalled, half buried in the loose dunes. The Afrika Korps had seen difficult roads before, but nothing prepared them for this stretch of desert, a stretch so soft it behaved like water. Trucks sank until their axles kissed sand. Men cursed, pushed, dug, and tied ropes to half-broken vehicles. One officer muttered that the desert fought harder than the British. Then, from beyond the ridge, came a strange, high-pitched buzzing, nothing like the throaty diesel of a Blitz truck or the rumble of a Panzer. Several Germans turned, squinting against the glare. A tiny vehicle bounced into view. Two American soldiers sat inside, dust-covered helmets, goggles down, shirts open to the heat. The little machine hopped over dunes like a dragonfly skipping across a pond. It was half the size of a German Kübelwagen, maybe less. Too small to be useful. Too light to matter. Too ridiculous to survive this kind of terrain. The Germans erupted in laughter. Ein Spielzeug, one shouted. A toy. But the laughter didn't last. The Jeep, a Willys MB, never slowed. It skimmed across the sand, its narrow tires slicing forward where the heavier German trucks dug themselves into graves. The soldiers watched as it hit a dune at a sharp angle, leaned dangerously, then surged upward with a growling determination completely disproportionate to its tiny size. The Germans stopped laughing. They stared. Because behind the Jeep, kicking up a rooster tail of sand, was something none of them expected. A small artillery piece, an American 37mm anti-tank gun, towed behind the vehicle as if it weighed nothing at all. The sight felt impossible. Here the Germans were, sweating, swearing, buried up to their boots in sand, while a quarter-ton American Jeep danced across the desert hauling a cannon. One sergeant spat. That cannot be right. But it was. The little machine flew past the German column, engine screaming, suspension flexing like a wild animal. A few Germans instinctively stepped aside, even though it passed meters away. Something about its energy felt explosive, unpredictable, alive. And then the real blow came. A second Jeep followed, and a third. All towing guns. All moving at a speed no German vehicle could match. Soon a fourth Jeep appeared, but this one carried a full squad of infantrymen, knees touching, rifles angled outward, the vehicle shaking violently as it powered through terrain the Wehrmacht considered nearly impassable. This was the first time many German soldiers saw the American Jeep, and it shattered every assumption they had made about Allied mobility. They had mocked it. They had dismissed it. They had laughed at it. But now the truth was blindingly clear. This was no toy. This was a battlefield phenomenon, a weapon of logistics. A machine that gave the Americans something the Germans were slowly losing: momentum. Why it mattered immediately. In the desert, mobility was life. The side that moved faster survived longer, struck harder, and adapted quicker. German officers prided themselves on maneuver warfare, the art of striking from unexpected angles. The Jeep was maneuver warfare in mechanical form. It weighed barely 1,100 kilograms, less than half a Kübelwagen, a fraction of an Opel Blitz truck, and far lighter than any German off-road vehicle. Where German trucks relied on weight and traction, the Jeep relied on agility and raw drivetrain power. Its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine didn't sound like much, but it pulled the Jeep forward with tenacity, letting it leap across terrain, gun trailers bouncing behind like obedient shadows. A German lieutenant watched the tiny vehicle crest a dune and vanish. His men stood silently, some shading their eyes, others frozen mid-dig. He finally muttered, "If that thing is as durable as it looks, we have a problem." He didn't know it yet. None of them did, but the Jeep wouldn't remain a curiosity. Soon it would become one of the most feared, respected, and envied machines of the entire war. Because while tanks dominated battles, while planes ruled the skies, while ships shaped strategy, it was the Jeep that made armies move. It was the Jeep that carried messages, towed guns, transported wounded, hauled officers, scouted enemy lines, crossed rivers, pulled stuck vehicles free, and arrived where no truck or motorcycle dared attempt. In North Africa, the Germans had just witnessed the opening act. Normandy, Sicily, Italy, the Ardennes. The Jeep's legend was only beginning. Welcome to WWII Forgotten Fronts, a channel dedicated to the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the hidden machines that shaped the Second World War. Here we dive beyond the famous headlines to uncover stories buried in diaries, lost archives, and forgotten frontlines. If you're passionate about deep storytelling, real wartime experiences, and cinematic history, you've just found your new home. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. By the summer of 1943, the Afrika Korps had seen enough of the American Jeep to respect it, quietly, grudgingly, and with a hint of resentment. But in the mountains of Sicily, their skepticism finally collapsed under undeniable proof. The Willys MB was nearly impossible to kill. The setting was the tortured spine of the Sicilian interior, switchback roads carved into cliffs, jagged rocks that shredded tires, and slopes so steep that mules, not machines, were traditionally used to move equipment. German engineers had stationed themselves along one such path, documenting which Allied vehicles could traverse the terrain and which ones failed spectacularly. They expected the Jeep to fail. They wanted it to fail. They had already watched American half-tracks struggle, British trucks stall, and even some armored cars lose power on the inclines. A lightweight, underpowered American toy, as they still called it, had no chance, or so they assumed. A reconnaissance platoon of U.S. soldiers approached the slope in a pair of Jeeps, engines humming, drivers leaning forward as if urging their machines up with body language alone. The Germans observed from cover, binoculars raised. The Jeep began its climb. At first, it looked almost leisurely, its wheels finding grip where there seemed to be none, the engine revving confidently. Then the incline grew sharper, transforming from a steep road into something more like a wall. Dust kicked up behind the vehicle. Its front wheels lifted momentarily off the ground. A German observer whispered, "Jetzt bricht es." Now it breaks. But the Jeep didn't break. It continued climbing, slowly, stubbornly, relentlessly. The shocks compressed, the frame vibrated, the Jeep shuddered like a living creature fighting gravity itself. One misstep would have sent it tumbling backwards into a ravine. Yet, inch by inch, it climbed. When it finally crested the hilltop, the American driver let out a triumphant whoop that echoed across the cliffs. The German engineers were stunned. One officer slammed his notebook shut. "This machine is not logical," he muttered. The secret weapon, simplicity. What the Germans didn't understand, because they couldn't, was that the Jeep wasn't a product of flashy engineering. It wasn't advanced. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even particularly refined. It was simple. And simple, in war, becomes unbreakable. The Willys MB had a flathead four-cylinder Go Devil engine, easy to repair, hard to kill. A 3-speed transmission with a transfer case for true 4x4 power. Leaf spring suspension that soaked up punishment. No unnecessary armor, no fancy fittings, nothing that didn't contribute to movement. If something bent, soldiers hammered it straight. If something cracked, it was welded. If something clogged, it was cleared with a pocket knife. A British officer once joked, "Give me a Jeep, a wrench, and a corporal, and I'll give you a functioning vehicle in an hour." The Germans, masters of engineering complexity, had no machine that embraced such brutal minimalism. Their vehicles were beautiful, precise, and exquisitely designed, until bullets, mud, heat, or dust touched them. Then they became liabilities. The Jeep was the opposite. The worse conditions became, the stronger it performed. When the Jeep saved an entire column, still in Sicily, a German counterattack had forced American units to retreat along a narrow mountain road. Artillery thundered, mortar rounds crashed, dust and smoke swallowed the sky. In the chaos, a crucial anti-tank gun wedged itself between rocks and stalled the entire withdrawal. Trucks backed up. Soldiers shouted. Seconds felt like hours. The gun wasn't just stuck. It was blocking the only escape route. A German officer watching through binoculars smiled. The Americans were trapped. A perfect opportunity. Then, out of the smoke, a Jeep appeared. 2 soldiers jumped out, hooked chains to the gun, and signaled the driver. The Jeep lurched forward. Its tires spun, kicking gravel into the air. The gun didn't move. The driver didn't quit. He reversed, jerked forward again, and again, the engine screaming as if in pain. German observers laughed. The idea that such a tiny vehicle could free a heavy anti-tank gun was absurd. But the Jeep persisted. The chains went taut, and suddenly, agonizingly, the gun shifted, then slid, then rolled free. The entire American column erupted in cheers. The German officer lowered his binoculars and muttered, "This is becoming a problem." A reputation earned in every theater. By the time Sicily fell, the legend of the Jeep had crossed oceans. In the Pacific, Marines drove them across coral beaches and through steaming jungles. In Italy, they climbed muddy hillsides where mules quit. In Burma, Jeeps carried Chindits through nightmare terrain no truck or horse could endure. In Normandy, they became the veins and arteries of the Allied advance through the Bocage. Everywhere the Jeep went, it gained a reputation, not for power, not for beauty, not for size, but for refusal to surrender, just like the men who drove it. By late 1943, German field reports on the Willys MB Jeep had accumulated into a thick, uneven stack. Notes scrawled in trenches, after-action observations, frustrated remarks from logistics officers, and intelligence briefings that tried, unsuccessfully, to explain the machine's uncanny performance. At first, the Wehrmacht dismissed the Jeep as an amusing American eccentricity. By autumn, they treated it as a tactical variable. By winter, they classified it as a strategic threat. It began with a simple, uncomfortable realization. The Jeep appeared everywhere. In the desert, in the mountains, in forests, in river crossings, in villages, behind enemy lines, even abandoned by the enemy and quickly repurposed by German troops themselves. The vehicle became so common that one German captain wrote, "Wherever the Americans are, this machine is already there." But the problem wasn't merely its presence, it was its speed. The Jeep that should not have been there. The moment that changed German evaluations occurred in Italy, near the Volturno River. A German commander had deployed scouts to monitor a narrow valley road leading to an artillery position. Mines were laid. The road was watched. A fast breakthrough was impossible. Or so the Germans thought. In the early morning fog, as the sun struggled to break over the ridgeline, a noise echoed through the valley, soft at first, then rising like a swarm of mechanical insects. The scouts blinked. Impossible. From behind their position, from a goat trail barely wide enough for pack animals, came two Jeeps, riding single file, suspension shaking, wheels gripping the uneven stone path. The Germans stared, stunned. Their supply trucks had spent 2 days attempting to navigate that same trail. The Jeeps did it in 20 minutes. The lead American driver waved casually as he passed, as if he had taken a scenic shortcut rather than performed a logistical impossibility. The German commander slammed his fist on the map table. "How are they everywhere at once?" he demanded. His intelligence officer offered the only answer he could, "Because their Jeep goes where our trucks cannot." Intelligence begins a formal study. Soon, the German High Command ordered systematic evaluations of captured Jeeps. Engineers disassembled them with clinical precision, searching for the secret behind their performance. They expected to find clever engineering. They expected hidden mechanisms. They expected innovation. What they found instead was infuriating, a masterpiece of simplicity. The engine? Low compression, forgiving, easy to maintain. The drivetrain? Straightforward yet shockingly capable. The suspension? Rugged and brutally utilitarian. The frame? Light, flexible, and designed to twist rather than fracture. The electrical system? Minimalistic and field-proof. One German colonel summed it up bitterly. Everything unnecessary is absent. Everything necessary is present. That is the secret. To German engineers, masters of refined mechanics, this was almost insulting. They had built technological marvels, half-tracks with complex steering systems, trucks with exquisite transmissions, and armored cars with specialized suspensions. And yet, here was a crude American box on wheels, outperforming them all. The unstoppable supply chain. As reports from Italy, Sicily, and the Eastern Front piled in, another pattern emerged. Allied logistics grew faster and more flexible wherever Jeeps appeared. A German logistics officer, writing from the Gustav Line, made a chilling observation. The Jeep is not a vehicle, it is a multiplier. And he was right. Consider a typical German supply convoy. Heavy trucks, vulnerable to mud, slow over hills, reliant on wide roads, hard to repair, fuel-hungry. Now consider an American supply column built around Jeeps. Light, fast, able to detour across fields, repairable in minutes, capable of towing light guns or trailers, able to operate independently of main roads, far more resilient to ambush or artillery fire. Suddenly, Allied units could deploy quickly, resupply forward positions, extract wounded, carry messages, scout terrain, and coordinate artillery, all with one universal vehicle. The Jeep didn't just move soldiers, it moved the war. When Germans captured Jeeps and refused to give them back, one of the most telling signs of respect came from captured Jeep usage. German soldiers frequently seized abandoned or damaged Jeeps, repaired them, repainted them, and used them as reconnaissance or command vehicles. Some German officers liked the Jeeps so much they refused to return captured units for inventory. A Wehrmacht mechanic wrote, "I would trade 3 of our field cars for 1 Jeep. It is the only American machine I trust." The irony was sharp. The Germans, who once mocked the Jeep as flimsy, now relied on it whenever they could. The realization that sank morale. By the winter of 1943-44, German analysts reached a grim conclusion. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle the Allies used. It was a vehicle the Allies depended on, and one the Germans could not match. Because while the Wehrmacht had superior tanks in some battles, while they had excellent optics, guns, and armored vehicles, they lacked the humble workhorse that made the American army move faster, react quicker, and recover from setbacks with dizzying speed. The Jeep didn't win battles with firepower. It won them with presence. And German troops? They were starting to feel surrounded, not by tanks or planes, but by an army that moved like water, carried forward by millions of spinning Jeep wheels. Italy, winter 1943. Rain hammered the Apennines, turning roads into rivers of sludge. German and American units clashed in a night of confusion, flares arcing overhead, artillery rumbling in the distance, machine gun bursts echoing off the mountains. In this chaos, mobility meant survival. And on that night, the Jeep earned its reputation as the machine that outran death. The battle began when German forces attempted a surprise counterattack, pushing through a mountain pass where American infantry and artillery were still setting up. The moment the first shots rang out, the geography worked against the Americans. One narrow road, sheer drops to one side, mud deep enough to swallow boots, convoys stacked bumper to bumper. Retreat became impossible. Advancing seemed suicidal. A German officer observing the battlefield noted triumphantly, "Now we have them. They cannot move." For any ordinary vehicle, he would have been right. But the Americans did not rely on ordinary vehicles. The convoy that should have died, an American artillery battery, 4 105mm howitzers, found itself trapped in the kill zone. Their supporting trucks skidded helplessly. The guns sat exposed. German machine guns opened up, walking tracer fire across the road. A sergeant shouted over the chaos, "Get the Jeeps up front! Move!" The small vehicles responded instantly. One by one, they shot forward through gaps in the stalled convoy. Where a truck needed space to maneuver, a Jeep needed inches. Where a truck needed traction, a Jeep simply bounced forward, finding grip on surfaces that looked like chocolate pudding. A German gunner watching through binoculars blinked in disbelief. "They are sprinting?" he said, unsure whether to believe his own eyes. The Jeeps leapt over potholes, skidded sideways, threaded between immobilized vehicles, and raced toward the exposed artillery crews. Incoming mortar rounds showered the road with mud. Shrapnel hissed through the air. Even horses panicked and broke free. But the Jeeps kept moving. It was as if the little machines didn't understand fear. Rescue under fire. When the first Jeep reached the forward gun crews, the situation had deteriorated. German troops were closing in through the tree line. What the Americans feared most was becoming inevitable. The guns would be overrun and captured. But the Jeep crews had a plan. The first pair of soldiers jumped out, hooked chains to the howitzer limber, and shouted, "Go, go, go!" The driver floored it. The Jeep lurched. The tow chains strained. The howitzer skidded sideways, its wheels sinking into the mud. A German machine gun opened up, sparking off rocks inches from the Jeep's hood. Dirt sprayed into the air. The driver kept his foot down. The chains tightened again. And the howitzer moved. Slowly, agonizingly, it rolled free. Another Jeep arrived and hooked onto the next gun. Then another, and another. Before long, the entire artillery battery was being pulled back by a swarm of Jeeps, each one fighting mud, gravity, and enemy fire. A German lieutenant watching from above muttered, "That is not a vehicle. That is madness with wheels." The turning point. As the guns were dragged up the slope, something remarkable happened. The American line, moments earlier on the verge of collapse, began to stabilize. Why? Because artillery could now be repositioned, because ammunition could now be delivered, because wounded soldiers could now be evacuated, because the jeep crews had restored mobility, the heartbeat of any battlefield. In war, the side that moves controls the fight. The Germans suddenly found themselves losing control. Their advance slowed. Their momentum evaporated. And within an hour, American artillery was firing again, this time from a safer position, thanks entirely to the jeeps that had hauled them there through mud that should have been impassable. The German counterattack faltered, then broke, then retreated. And in the after-action reports, one American captain wrote, "Without our jeeps, the battery would have been lost. Without the battery, the pass would have fallen. Without the pass, the entire sector collapses." A German report, found after the war, described the incident differently, but with equal clarity. The enemy's small car allowed them to withdraw guns with impossible speed. It behaved as if unaffected by terrain or fire. The legend grows. By dawn, the road was quiet again. Rain still fell. Smoke drifted through the valleys. But scattered along the path, mud-covered, bullet-scarred, dented, and steaming, were the vehicles that had rewritten the night's outcome. 4 jeeps, standing like survivors of a storm. American soldiers walked past, patting their hoods, laughing in relief. One private said, "They should have put wings on these things. I swear they fly." Another replied, "Why bother? They already do what planes can't." Word spread quickly. The battery had been saved, the pass had held, and the jeep had earned another chapter in its growing legend, the night it outran panic and outmaneuvered death. The Germans didn't forget that lesson. They couldn't. From that night on, whenever they saw a jeep emerging through smoke or bouncing across terrain that defied logic, they felt the same sinking realization. If the jeep is here, the Americans won't be far behind. Normandy, June 1944. The beaches had been taken, but the real battle, the brutal struggle through the bocage, was just beginning. Every hedgerow was a fortress. Every farm lane could hide a machine gun nest or a panzer waiting in ambush. The Allies needed eyes, ears, and speed in terrain where tanks crawled and infantry bled for every meter. They needed the jeep. But this time, it wasn't just its mobility that stunned the Germans. It was its silence. The ghosts of the bocage. Before dawn, a reconnaissance unit from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division moved out. Their mission, locate a series of German anti-tank guns rumored to be positioned behind a maze of hedgerows. These guns had already knocked out several Shermans. Finding them before they could fire again was critical. The jeep crews removed everything that rattled, canteens, tools, loose metal, and wrapped them in cloth. Engines were tuned to run as quietly as possible. Helmets were strapped tightly. Rifles rested on knees. At a 400, they vanished into the mist. The countryside swallowed them whole. German sentries along the lanes heard nothing. No engines, no voices, no metal clinking. Nothing but morning birdsong and the rustling of hedgerow leaves. 2 jeeps moved like shadows, their low-slung bodies hugging the terrain, tires whispering over damp soil. Their drivers knew every trick, coasting downhill with engines off, feathering the throttle, letting the jeep idle like a heartbeat. Germans called this terrain Höllengarten, the Garden of Hell. On this morning, the jeeps owned it. The first encounter. Near a fork in a narrow lane, the lead jeep froze. A silhouette, a helmet's rim, the glint of a rifle barrel poking through a gap in the hedge. German sentry. The Americans exchanged hand signals. The jeep rolled backward, silently. The Germans remained unaware. The crew then slipped into a side path, circled around the hedgerow, and emerged behind the sentry, observing an entire German gun emplacement hidden among apple trees. 4 75mm PaK-40s. Infantry dug in, a perfect kill zone. The Americans had found exactly what the division had been searching for. One of the scouts whispered, "If we hadn't come in quiet, we'd be dead men." They withdrew just as silently, leaving the Germans oblivious to the fact that their secret positions had been exposed. Within the hour, American artillery smashed the emplacement into splinters. A captured German corporal later asked, "How did your tanks know where we were? No patrol came near us." He was told the truth. He didn't believe it. The silent run. That same afternoon, German units attempted a counterattack, sending armored cars and infantry through a network of lanes south of Saint-Lô. The first sign of trouble was a column of smoke rising behind Allied lines. The second was a frantic radio call from a pinned infantry company. A jeep team was dispatched. Just one jeep. Just 2 men. Just enough to make the difference. They moved at full speed through the hedgerows, taking sharp turns, bouncing over ditches, the suspension groaning with every impact. The sound should have given them away, but the Germans were firing their weapons so loudly that the jeep's engine noise dissolved into the chaos. Then came the miracle. The jeep burst from a hedgerow onto a road behind the advancing German infantry. Dust sprayed. The Germans spun around in shock. One German NCO shouted, "Was ist das?" He expected a tank. He expected armored cars. He expected something powerful. He did not expect a tiny vehicle with 2 Americans holding onto the roll bar. The jeep didn't hesitate. It raced down the lane, weaving between German soldiers, bullets snapping past. Several Germans dove into the hedges just to avoid being run down. The jeep shot through the formation as if the enemy didn't exist. Its mission wasn't to fight. Its mission was to warn. Minutes later, American artillery fired on pre-registered coordinates. The counterattack collapsed. The infantry company was saved, a trophy no German could catch. German after-action reports revealed something extraordinary. They couldn't hit the jeep. Their gunners tracked it. Their machine gunners tried to lead it. Their rifles fired at every opportunity. But the jeep was too small, too fast, too agile, and too unpredictable. One German gunner wrote, "It moved like an insect, too quick to aim at, too light to stop, and gone before you could fire." The jeep wasn't armored. It wasn't protected. Its best defense was simply not being where the bullet arrived. This infuriated German commanders. Their carefully planned ambushes lost effectiveness. Their patrols were outmaneuvered. Their artillery positions were revealed before they fired, all because of a quarter-ton vehicle the Germans thought was beneath their notice. They didn't laugh anymore. The real impact. Information warfare. In the bocage, the jeep became the fastest information courier in the theater. It linked platoons to battalions, battalions to regiments, and artillery to forward observers. One American officer said, "A jeep and a radio beat a Tiger tank any day, if you know where the Tiger is first." The Germans learned that lesson the hard way, again and again. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting 2 wars at once: the obvious war of tanks, gunfire, and collapsing fronts, and a quieter war that bled them just as badly, the war of time. Every German plan depended on timing. Counterattacks required coordination. Retreats required precision. Reinforcements needed to arrive before the line broke, not after. But again and again, something infuriating happened. The Americans got there first. Not because they had more trucks, not because they had better maps, not because they were better supplied, but because they had the jeep. And the jeep didn't respect German timelines, the race for the bridge. Near the Siegfried Line, German officers prepared a textbook counterattack. A small stone bridge over a river was the key. If they seized it and blew it, the American advance in the sector would halt for at least a day. That day could shift an entire division, allow a withdrawal, and stabilize collapsing terrain. At 0500, the Germans moved out, infantry in the lead, engineers behind them, and an armored car covering the flanks. They calculated they would reach the bridge before the Americans even realized its value. But they hadn't accounted for one thing. A jeep patrol was already moving. 2 jeeps, to be exact. 4 men total, sent hours earlier to scout ahead. They drove through mist and dew-soaked grass, engines humming with barely contained eagerness. The drivers pushed speed where no truck dared, bouncing violently off ruts, skidding down slopes, and powering through riverbeds as if physics were a suggestion instead of a rule. They reached the bridge first. When the Germans arrived, ready to secure it, the Americans were already dug in, with machine guns, with radios, with artillery coordinates already relayed. A German officer stared in disbelief. "How did they beat us here? They have no road." His subordinate replied, almost angrily, "They don't need roads. They have those damn cars." The counterattack failed before it began. The bridge held. The American timeline remained intact. The night run through the forest. Another incident, kept quiet in German records for years, occurred in the Hürtgen forest. A German battalion attempted to reposition under cover of darkness, hoping to surprise an exposed American regiment at dawn. The plan depended on secrecy. But secrecy died the moment a single jeep entered the forest. The little vehicle wasn't even on a road. It simply followed tank tracks and deer trails, its headlights blacked out, its crew navigating by moonlight cutting through the trees. The jeep shouldn't have been able to move here. The forest floor was a mess of roots, stumps, puddles, and mud. But it moved anyway. A German squad heard something, a faint rattle, a soft roll of tires, and assumed it was wildlife. Seconds later, the jeep burst from the tree line, slid past the Germans, and vanished before they could even shoulder their rifles. By the time the battalion reached its jump-off point, American artillery was already firing. The timeline had been stolen. Again, by the jeep. One German sergeant cursed. Even our messages cannot move as fast as their cars. The machine that slowed a retreat. By late 1944, the Germans were often retreating, sometimes orderly, sometimes not. But every retreat required one thing above all else: space. The space to pull back without being overrun. The jeep denied them that space. American units used the vehicles like mechanical wolves, harassing the retreat, cutting off crossroads, overrunning command posts, and arriving at key choke points long before the bulk of American infantry or tanks could follow. A German major wrote, "A jeep is not dangerous by itself, but where a jeep appears, an entire American force appears moments later." The psychological effect was devastating. The Germans could no longer predict when it was safe to move. A retreat planned for midnight could be disrupted at 23:30. A withdrawal scheduled for dawn might be intercepted at 5:45. Time, once a German strength in blitzkrieg, had flipped sides. The jeep made the Americans faster than the Germans had ever been. And speed wins wars. The unexpected capture. One evening, a German recon team finally managed to ambush a jeep, killing the driver and capturing the vehicle intact. They inspected everything. They found no armor, no special equipment, no advanced engineering, no hidden reserve fuel, no German-style refinement. Just a simple clutch, a simple gearbox, a simple chassis, and a simple transfer case. The German lieutenant shook his head in frustration. "How does such a primitive machine defeat us?" His sergeant answered, "Because it doesn't stop, Herr Leutnant. Not for mud, not for hills, not for rivers, not for darkness, not for us." The lieutenant didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The realization that changed everything. By the end of 1944, German commanders had reached a chilling conclusion. They could no longer outmaneuver the Americans. Because maneuver warfare depends on movement, and movement depends on vehicles. And the Americans had built a vehicle that turned every hill into a highway, every forest into a corridor, every field into a road, every riverbank into a launch point. Where German logistics hesitated, the jeep surged. Where German timetables were precise, the jeep erased them. Where German troops expected silence, the jeep arrived unexpectedly. Where German armored cars turned back, the jeep pressed onward. Time, the most valuable commodity in war, belonged to the side with the humble American jeep. By the winter of 1944, the American jeep had done something extraordinary, something no one on the German general staff had expected. It had become a weapon. Not a weapon through firepower, not a weapon through armor, not a weapon through intimidation, but through presence. Wherever a jeep appeared, German units grew tense, commanders grew cautious, and timelines shrank. The machine had become a symbol of American reach, fast, tireless, unpredictable, and always arriving before it should. Yet the jeep's most unexpected triumph came not from mobility, but from silence. It allowed the Americans to control the battlefield without firing a single bullet. The crossroads that should have been taken. Belgium, December 1944, the Ardennes offensive. German divisions surged through the mist, aiming to seize key road junctions before American forces could react. Speed was everything. If the Germans could hold certain crossroads, they could choke Allied movement and carve open a path toward the Meuse. One such junction lay near a village whose name the Americans themselves barely knew. It was guarded by only a handful of infantry and engineers, far too few to resist a determined German push. But the Americans had something the Germans didn't expect: a jeep patrol. 2 jeeps were dispatched at dawn to scout enemy movement. Snow crunched beneath their tires as they navigated icy farm tracks. Their engines, muffled by the cold, sounded deceptively gentle, almost peaceful against the distant rumble of artillery. From a hill overlooking the junction, the Jeep crews saw it. A German column, infantry, half-tracks, and an armored car moving directly toward the crossroads. The American lieutenant knew his force couldn't stop them conventionally, so he didn't try. Instead, he positioned the Jeeps, one on each approach road, and waited. The power of being seen. When the German scouts approached the village, they froze. They expected to see empty roads or panicked American stragglers. Instead, they saw a Jeep, just sitting there, engine idling, crew calm, weapons manned. To the Germans, this meant one thing. Americans were already in position. Americans were already organized. Americans were already watching. The German advance halted. They waited for orders. Those orders never came because the commander, far behind the scouts, had to reevaluate. How strong was the American force? How many reinforcements had arrived? Was the junction already lost? He delayed. Minutes ticked by, then more minutes, then an hour, then two. The Germans dug in, preparing to attack, but their momentum was gone. All because a Jeep happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right posture. One German NCO later wrote, "We saw the small car and assumed the worst. It is strange to fear a toy." But he didn't know the truth. Behind that Jeep, no reinforcements, no tanks, no battalion, just two Jeeps, 8 men, and whatever courage they could scrape together. Yet the Germans had surrendered initiative simply by seeing them. The Jeep that blocked an army, huh? As the German delay stretched into the afternoon, American artillery finally arrived, then more infantry, then tank destroyers. By dusk, the crossroads was fully secure, a position that should have fallen easily, but didn't. Because the Germans hesitated, because a Jeep stood there, because presence is a weapon. The psychology of the unassuming. German psychological reports after the Ardennes noted something fascinating. The Jeep created uncertainty, and uncertainty kills momentum. When German units saw Shermans, they knew the threat. When they saw half-tracks, they understood the role. When they saw American infantry, they could estimate strength. But a Jeep? A Jeep meant scouts might be calling artillery. A column could be right behind. Engineers could be preparing obstacles. A tank destroyer platoon might be lurking nearby. An entire regiment could be minutes away. The Germans had no idea. The Jeep revealed nothing. The Jeep denied information. The Jeep disrupted decision-making. It was, in its own quiet way, a psychological weapon. The unassuming giant. At American command posts, generals joked that the Jeep was the smallest big thing in the war. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't roar like a tank. It didn't thunder like artillery. It didn't drop bombs from 20,000 feet. But it shaped the outcome of battles anyway. A sergeant in the 90th Infantry Division put it best. When a Jeep shows up, hope shows up. And the Germans knew it. The moment a Jeep arrived on the horizon, dust trailing behind it, windshield down, radio antenna bouncing, German commanders reacted. Plans shifted. Attacks slowed. Recon intensified. Fear crept in. Not fear of the Jeep itself. Fear of what followed. The machine that shifted the balance. By early January, the Germans understood the unspoken rule of the American advance. Where there is one Jeep, there are always more. And behind them, artillery, infantry, armor. A logistics engine the Germans could not stop. A single Jeep could change a battle. A dozen could change a sector. 10,000 changed the war. And they did it without firing a single shot. By the spring of 1945, the German army was exhausted, starved of fuel, crippled by air attacks, and forced into defensive warfare across terrain that no longer favored them. But even in retreat, they relied on one ally nature always provided: mud. For decades, German doctrine had counted on terrain, snow, forests, mountains, rivers, and especially mud, as a natural equalizer. Tanks could be slowed, trucks immobilized, artillery bogged down. Maneuver warfare died in the mire. Everything became a slogging match. German command believed this would finally halt the American advance. They were wrong, because the Americans had brought the one machine that treated mud like it was just another type of road: the Jeep. The village that should have been unreachable. Near Cologne, a small German garrison was ordered to hold a village cut off by a swollen river and miles of deep mud. The bridges had been destroyed. German trucks couldn't pass. Even horses struggled. Commanders assumed the Americans wouldn't attempt a direct approach. They underestimated the Jeep. On the second day of contact, a German lookout spotted movement far across the fields, low silhouettes bouncing erratically. At first, he assumed they were infantry crawling. Then the shapes grew larger. Jeeps, not on roads, not on firm ground, but moving straight across open fields that looked like wet cement. The German officer beside him scoffed. Impossible. They will sink. But they didn't. The jeeps surged forward, engines whining, tires slashing through muck, suspensions absorbing violent jolts as if the ground beneath them were merely an inconvenience. Their lightweight frames didn't settle into the mud. They skimmed across it, sometimes fishtailing, sometimes sliding, yet always advancing. German troops stared in disbelief. They had been counting on the mud. The mud betrayed them. The machine that made engineers obsolete. The jeeps weren't just traveling through the mud, they were working in it. One jeep towed cable for a makeshift ferry. Another hauled planks for a temporary footbridge. Another delivered ammunition across terrain. German supply units refused to enter. Another evacuated wounded men who otherwise would have died in place. In a single afternoon, the jeep did the work of trucks, horses, engineers, ambulances, recon units. Mud, once Germany's greatest defensive partner, had become Allied territory. A German corporal watching the spectacle whispered, "Nothing stops these devils." The jeep that broke the deadlock. Later that night, American units attempted to flank the village. German commanders again trusted the mud to slow them. Now it was raining. Deep puddles filled every depression. Fields were turning into ponds. This should have been a sanctuary for the defenders. Instead, they heard it. Bouncing, sputtering, growling. The jeeps had returned, this time carrying troops. They weren't supposed to be able to do that. Not across this terrain, not in darkness, not in the rain. But the jeeps arrived anyway, delivering infantry to positions the Germans had not even thought to defend, because reaching them on foot would require wading through waist-high mud. The Germans, surrounded and outmaneuvered, surrendered before dawn. The American officer who accepted their surrender remarked, "You have good soldiers. The ground just doesn't work for you anymore." The German commander replied bitterly, "It works for you too well." The secret of the mud miracle. German engineers dissected the problem. Why did the jeep perform so well in mud? The answer was simple and humiliating. Weight distribution. The jeep pushed only about 400 pounds per wheel, far lower than German trucks or armored cars. It floated across mud instead of sinking into it. Its short wheelbase allowed rapid changes of direction. Its 4x4 drivetrain clawed forward even when half the wheels were submerged. A German report concluded, "It is not a car, it is a mechanical goat." The compliment was unintentional, but accurate. The escape through the swamp. The most dramatic example came days later, when an American patrol found itself cut off by German artillery. And their only escape route was through a swampy patch of ground that officers had specifically marked as impassable. The jeep driver didn't hesitate. He shifted into low gear. He leaned forward as if urging his machine toward freedom. Then he plunged into the swamp. Mud erupted, water splashed. The jeep sank to the hubs, but it kept moving. Slowly, painfully, dragging itself forward with sheer mechanical stubbornness. The passengers bailed water with helmets. A machine gunner sat on the hood to balance the weight. It looked absurd. It looked hopeless. But the jeep emerged from the swamp alive, and the patrol with it. A German prisoner who later heard the story remarked, "Your little car has more courage than many soldiers." The mud that changed the war. By the end of March 1945, German commanders no longer trusted the terrain they once depended on. Fields, riversides, marshes, and rain-soaked hills, places once considered natural barriers, had become Allied pathways. Because anything the Germans believed would slow the American advance only served to slow German vehicles. The jeep remained unaffected. In the final weeks of the war, German officers joked grimly, "We do not fight the American army. We fight their cars." And in more ways than they realized, it was true. By April 1945, the German army was unraveling. Retreats became collapses. Units dissolved under pressure. Communications broke down. Roads clogged with refugees, wounded men, burnt-out vehicles, and abandoned equipment. It was a battlefield where order died quickly. And in war, disorder is fatal. But the Americans had something the Germans lacked, a machine built for chaos. The jeep didn't just survive confusion, it thrived in it. where trucks jammed, where tanks stalled, where horses panicked, where staff cars got trapped, the Jeep slipped through like water through cracks in stone. To the collapsing Wehrmacht, it became a symbol of American control, not through force, but through agility. And nowhere was this clearer than during the race to secure the Ruhr. The road of panic. On the outskirts of the Ruhr pocket, German forces attempted a desperate withdrawal. Roads were jammed with ox carts, half-tracks, armored cars, civilian wagons, trucks loaded with evacuees, columns of infantry, scattered motorcycles, abandoned tanks choking intersections. It was a river of panic flowing in one direction. Then came the Americans. But the Americans brought jeeps. A column of jeeps zipped along the edges of the chaos, hugging ditches, leaping over debris, weaving through gaps that seemed too small for a bicycle. Drivers didn't slow down. They accelerated, using momentum as a weapon. One German lieutenant watching from a farmhouse window felt disbelief harden into dread. They navigate this madness as if it were a parade. His adjutant replied, "They bring order with them." Command in motion. The American Jeep did something the German staff cars could not. It allowed commanders to command while moving. Even as the Germans struggled to reorganize, American battalion leaders were already at the front, radio in hand, Jeep engine growling behind them. Orders flowed instantly. Situations were corrected in minutes instead of hours. A German major captured after the war wrote, "Our biggest weakness was that orders moved too slowly. The enemy's strength was that their orders moved on wheels." A Jeep with a radio was worth a German truck convoy of messengers. The bottleneck that should have stopped everything. Near the river Lenne, a blown bridge reduced the main German withdrawal route to a narrow detour across a muddy slope. German vehicles bogged down instantly, creating a wall of steel and misery. American infantry advancing behind them expected the Germans to hold the ground for at least a day. But the Jeep crews had other plans. A squad of engineers and scouts, 8 men, 4 Jeeps, arrived at the obstacle, surveyed it for 10 seconds, then acted. One Jeep pulled out winch cables, another hauled logs. A third dragged abandoned German planks into place. The fourth ferried men and tools between trouble spots. In under 15 minutes, a miracle in wartime, the Americans had built a functional bypass. A bypass only a Jeep could navigate. American infantry poured through behind them. A German soldier watching from the tree line muttered, "It should not be possible to build a road that fast." But they hadn't built a road. They had built a Jeep path, and that was enough. The checkpoint of one vehicle. That same day, a single Jeep blocked a German battalion's escape. It happened at a crossroads where fleeing German units expected to pass freely. They saw no tanks, no Shermans, no armored column, just one Jeep, windshield down, 50 cal machine gun mounted. The Germans hesitated, not because of the Jeep, but because the Jeep represented uncertainty. Where there was one, there could be many. Where there was a 50 cal, there could be artillery behind it. Where there was an American vehicle, there could be an ambush. The German column delayed. 2 minutes, then 5, then 10. Just long enough for American armor to arrive and seal the escape route. One German officer later recorded bitterly, "We were not defeated by the American Jeep. We were defeated by what it implied." The Jeep that could not be trapped. In urban fighting, German defenders often set ambushes for tanks and half-tracks. Narrow alleys, rubble piles, destroyed trams, all perfect traps. But the Jeep refused to be trapped. If it couldn't go forward, it went backward. If it couldn't go backward, it went across a sidewalk. If the sidewalk was blocked, it drove through a doorway. If the doorway was too small, it simply smashed through the wall beside it. American soldiers joked that the Jeep wasn't a car, it was a cockroach. It went anywhere. It survived anything. It solved problems by ignoring them. German troops, exhausted and demoralized, were stunned by this mechanical resilience. One report from the Ruhr summarized the frustration. The enemy's small car cannot be predicted. It appears where no vehicle should appear. The machine that made an army feel inevitable. By the final weeks of the war, the Jeep had become more than transport, more than mobility, more than logistics. It was momentum incarnate. When German troops saw Jeeps racing forward, dust trailing behind, soldiers gripping the roll bars, radio antennas whipping in the wind, they felt something they had never felt during the early years of Blitzkrieg. The feeling that the enemy was everywhere. Every road, Every village, every crossing, every ridge, wherever they retreated, a jeep was already there. Wherever they regrouped, a jeep appeared. Wherever they held their ground, a jeep probed the flank. It was a small machine with a large shadow. And in war, shadows matter. Throughout the war, German soldiers mocked the jeep for one simple reason. It wasn't a fighting machine. No armor, no turret, no cannon, no steel plating, no intimidation factor. It was, in their eyes, a courier toy, useful for messengers and officers, but laughably vulnerable on a real battlefield. They learned otherwise in the final months of the war, when the Jeep began performing feats that defied every assumption German doctrine had about light vehicles. The Jeep didn't just move the war, it fought in it, and sometimes it fought enemies many times its size. The encounter at the orchard. Near Kassel, a German armored reconnaissance unit was sweeping through a cluster of orchards when they spotted movement. Two jeeps rolling between the apple trees, bouncing over roots, carrying what appeared to be lightly armed scouts. A predictable engagement. The Germans, mounted in armored cars, expected the Americans to flee. Instead, the jeeps accelerated toward them. The Germans were stunned. No one charges armored cars with unarmored vehicles. No one sane anyway. But the Americans weren't insane. They were armed. Both jeeps braked sharply, pivoted sideways, and unleashed a storm of .50 caliber machine gun fire, one of the most feared infantry weapons of the war. The German armored car commander felt the impacts hammering the turret. It wasn't penetrating, but it was disabling. Optics shattered. Exposed crew ducked. The gun shield sparked under the relentless impact. Everything not armored cracked, bent, or broke. Then came the real threat: tires. Armored cars rely on mobility. Anti-armor rounds couldn't easily pierce their plating, but .50 cal fire could shred their wheels. And it did. The armored car slewed sideways, immobilized. The second armored car panicked and reversed directly into a ditch. The jeeps didn't stay to claim a kill. They didn't need to. They simply vanished into the orchards, two unarmored vehicles that had defeated a force 10 times heavier without losing a man. A German crewman later said, "We did not understand what happened. It was like being attacked by hornets." The gun the Germans hadn't expected. The .50 cal Browning M2, mounted on many jeeps, was a weapon the Germans respected but did not fear on open battlefields. But on jeeps, it became unpredictable, mobile death. The Germans couldn't grasp how such a small vehicle absorbed the recoil. They didn't realize the secret. The jeep danced with the gun. It didn't resist the recoil. It rolled with it, shifted weight, absorbed the shock through its suspension. A German technical report complained, the enemy's light car should be thrown over by the heavy machine gun. Instead, it behaves as if it is alive. The ambush on the river road. In another battle near the Elbe, a German anti-tank team set up along a narrow riverside road. Their job, destroy any American vehicle that attempted to cross the bridge. They expected Shermans. They expected half-tracks. They expected trucks loaded with infantry. They did not expect what appeared next. A single jeep, not just carrying two men, carrying an anti-tank gun, a 57mm AT gun, towed behind it like a stubborn mule. The German gunner blinked. A jeep? Bringing artillery? Before he could fire, the jeep swung sideways, brakes screaming, and the AT gun crew detached the weapon with motion so fast it looked rehearsed. Within seconds, the gun was in position. The Americans had range. The German team was exposed. The first shot destroyed the German gun. The second shot sent their loader running. The third shot detonated ammunition stored nearby. The German survivors later described the sensation. It felt like the Americans had teleported artillery. But it wasn't teleportation. It was the jeep doing what trucks couldn't, arriving first. The jeep as a tank hunter. Contrary to many myths, jeeps were never meant to fight tanks. But they did, often. In the final weeks of the war, when battle lines blurred and units became isolated, jeep crews sometimes ambushed German vehicles using bazookas, Piats, rifle grenades, satchel charges, .50 cal guns at point-blank range. One famous engagement in Bavaria saw a jeep crew disable a German Zug 3 assault gun by firing a bazooka from behind while using the jeep as a firing platform. The German crew bailed out in disbelief. Shot by a car, one survivor grumbled. But the jeep wasn't a car anymore. It was improvisation embodied. A platform for whatever weapon soldiers needed. A solution for whatever tactical hole appeared. A tool that turned ordinary men into extraordinary threats. Why the Germans feared what the Jeep represented. It wasn't the armor, it wasn't the gun, it wasn't the power, it was the unpredictability. German doctrine valued control. The Jeep thrived on chaos. German vehicles required planning. The Jeep required only opportunity. German units feared the unexpected. The Jeep was the unexpected. It could tow artillery, it could hunt armor, it could ferry troops, it could cut comms, it could outrun ambushes, it could appear anywhere, anytime, without warning. A German captain wrote, "The small American car is the most dangerous vehicle on the battlefield because we never know what it will do next." He wasn't wrong. As the final weeks of the European War bled into May 1945, the American Jeep had become something more than a vehicle. It was a symbol of reach, of endurance, of momentum, of inevitability. But the Jeep's final, most overlooked contribution was not what it towed, or where it drove, or how it fought. It was the sheer weight of the war it carried, logistically, physically, psychologically, and emotionally. To the Americans, the Jeep became a lifeline. To the Germans, it became a shadow. To soldiers on both sides, it was the heartbeat of the battlefield. And by the war's final year, the Jeep wasn't merely supporting the American war effort, it was the American war effort. The Jeep that never rested. By 1945, many Jeeps had been running nearly nonstop for 3 years. Engines that should have failed kept running. Suspensions that should have collapsed kept bouncing. Frames that should have fractured bent and flexed but refused to break. German vehicles needed rest. German vehicles needed maintenance. German vehicles needed fuel, parts, workshops, mechanics. The Jeep needed none of these, not with any urgency. A U.S. sergeant joked, "You don't maintain a Jeep, you just apologize to it and keep going." This wasn't far from the truth. The Jeep carried wounded men, ammo crates, mortar tubes, radio equipment, spare parts, water cans, officers, scouts, prisoners, chaplains, stretchers, machine guns, rations, fuel cans, maps, medics. Everything fit into a Jeep because soldiers trusted that a Jeep could carry anything. And it did. The supply chain built on 4 wheels. In Germany, American supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles, yet they moved with astonishing speed because of the ubiquitous Jeep. Food, Jeep delivered. Ammo, Jeep delivered. Orders, Jeep delivered. Maps, Jeep delivered. Medicines, Jeep delivered. Communications wire, Jeep laid. Forward reconnaissance, Jeep led. To the Wehrmacht, this felt surreal. German logistics slogged forward. American logistics sprinted. One Wehrmacht colonel wrote bitterly, "We fight an enemy whose veins are paved roads and whose blood is gasoline." But he was wrong. The Americans weren't winning because of roads. They were winning because they had a vehicle that created roads where none existed. The evacuation that should have failed. One of the most remarkable Jeep stories came from a collapsing German suburb outside Leipzig. A squad of American infantry had been ambushed and pinned down inside a ruined factory. Smoke choked the air. German fire poured in from multiple directions. Radios were down. Medics couldn't reach them. A private crawled across rubble to the nearest Jeep driver and shouted, "They're dying in there. We need an evac route." The Jeep driver nodded. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for backup. He didn't wait for infantry cover. He simply drove, through smoke, through shattered walls, through broken glass, through doorways too small for sense but large enough for courage. Bullets sparked against the frame, bricks shattered against the hood, dust filled the air. He reached the trapped squad, who loaded their wounded onto the Jeep, bodies stacked in positions that seemed impossible. The Jeep bent under the weight but didn't quit. Then it backed out, full speed, engine screaming, tires clawing through debris. When they reached American lines, a lieutenant stared in disbelief. "You drove through that?" The driver shrugged. "It's a Jeep. It'll fit." The Jeep that broke German expectations. By 1945, the Germans understood something they had resisted for years. The Jeep didn't follow rules. Civilian cars followed roads. Military trucks followed orders. Tanks followed doctrine, but the Jeep followed need. And need is unpredictable. One German general confessed after the war, "We could anticipate tanks. We could anticipate bombers. We could anticipate artillery, but we could never anticipate the Jeep." That wasn't praise. It was surrender. The human side of the machine. Every American soldier had a Jeep story. And every story ended the same way. The Jeep got us through. It got them through snow. It got them through rivers. It got them through artillery fire. It got them through forests. It got them through ambushes. It got them through despair. Sometimes, when the war felt endless, soldiers leaned against their jeeps and watched the horizon. Sometimes, jeeps carried the wounded who whispered final words. Sometimes they carried officers whose decisions changed the front line. Sometimes they carried chaplains delivering last rites. Sometimes they carried prisoners who realized their war was over. The jeep carried the weight of men's hopes, and the weight of their fears, and the weight of the war itself. The machine that never lost its heart. In April 1945, as American forces crossed the Elbe and the Third Reich crumbled, a German captain watched American jeeps swarming through the fields and roads ahead of him. Exhausted, defeated, he lowered his binoculars and said softly, "The war is not ending. It is being carried forward." His adjutant asked, "By tanks?" The captain shook his head. "By those little cars." He was right. The jeep carried the war to its final mile, and Germany knew it. May 1945. The guns were falling silent. The Reich was collapsing. Columns of German soldiers marched with empty eyes and hollow stomachs, surrendering to a war they no longer understood. Bridges lay shattered, cities smoldered, roads twisted with wreckage. Yet through the ruins, one sound persisted, light, familiar, almost cheerful against the gloom, the buzzing growl of a jeep engine. The same sound German troops had laughed at in 1942, the same sound they had learned to fear in 1943. The same sound that haunted their retreats in 1944, the same sound that erased their last hopes in 1945. Now it echoed across a defeated nation. The jeep was everywhere, racing along roads, bouncing across fields, ferrying messages, delivering medical aid, broadcasting surrender terms, carrying chaplains, escorting prisoners, and guiding units toward pockets of resistance still unaware that the war was already lost. The jeep that had carried the war forward was now carrying peace into the ruins. The German officer who finally understood. In a small village west of Magdeburg, a German officer, Captain Reinhard Welke, waited to surrender his last company. His men were exhausted. Many were wounded. He had no vehicles left, not even bicycles. Then he heard it, the familiar stuttering hum of a jeep climbing the village road. 2 American soldiers sat inside, helmet straps loose, rifles slung casually. Expressions oddly calm for men entering a zone where desperate Germans might still resist. Welke stepped forward and raised his hands. The jeep rolled to a stop. The Americans didn't aim their weapons. They simply nodded. "Krieg ist vorbei," Welke said quietly. "The war is over." One American stepped out, offering a cigarette. In that moment, the German officer finally understood why the jeep had defeated them. Not through steel or firepower, but through something far more unsettling. It never stopped moving. The American army moved because the jeep moved. And the jeep moved because it refused to acknowledge the obstacles Germany depended on: terrain, distance, weather, complexity, doctrine. A machine that's simple should not have beaten a war machine as vast as the Wehrmacht. But it had. Welke looked at the jeep, at its dents and scratches, and murmured, "This little thing carried more victory on its back than all your tanks." The American shrugged. "It just gets us where we need to go." He didn't realize how profound that statement was. The machine that outlived its war. When peace formally came, the world began asking what to do with the mountains of equipment left behind. Tanks, trucks, rifles, cannons. But not with the jeep. The jeep simply kept going. Farmers bought them. Doctors used them to reach remote villages. Explorers drove them through jungles and deserts. Aid workers delivered medicine in them. Veterans restored them and drove them in parades. In some countries, jeeps remained in service for another 50 years, a testament to their durability and simplicity. Many ended up on ranches, fire departments, forestry services, mountain trails, and border patrol units. The jeep had survived the war because it wasn't built as a war machine. It was built as a tool. Tools do not retire. They simply change hands. The legacy the Germans could never match. When German engineers studied captured jeeps after the war, they admitted something unimaginable during the conflict. Had we built a vehicle like this, our war may have lasted longer, but we never would have built it. Why? Because German engineering was about precision. American engineering, when necessary, was about purpose. The jeep's purpose was brutally clear: get there, help there, fight there, survive there. Everything else, comfort, aesthetics, elegance, was irrelevant. The jeep democratized mobility. It shortened decision cycles. It turned reconnaissance into a weapon. It made logistics flexible. It erased terrain. It sped up withdrawals. It accelerated advances. It held roads no tank could hold. It crossed landscapes no truck could cross. It brought commanders to the front and wounded men to the rear. It was the circulatory system of the Allied war machine, unbreakable, unstoppable, unforgettable. The final image. On the day Germany surrendered, a jeep drove into the smoking courtyard of the shattered Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Soldiers climbed out, stared at the ruins of a dictatorship that once promised a 1,000-year empire, and lit cigarettes on what remained of a marble column. A German civilian watching from a basement doorway whispered to her son, "Das kleine Auto hat gewonnen." The little car won. She wasn't wrong. The jeep had carried men to victory. Now it carried them home. When historians later searched for a single machine that embodied the American way of war, fast, flexible, ingenious, relentless, and impossibly determined, they didn't choose the Sherman, or the Mustang, or the B-17, or the Higgins boat. They chose the Jeep, a machine so unassuming that soldiers joked it looked like something a child might draw. A machine so essential that Eisenhower himself listed it among the 4 tools that won the war. A machine so humble that even its enemies eventually had to admire it. The Jeep didn't conquer Germany. It simply arrived everywhere the war needed it to be. And it never stopped coming.